you would think that right now, with good prices of corn, good prices of soybeans, that everybody would be just ecstatic that uh, and making all kinds of money. And that's not what I'm hearing out in the country. In fact, I'm getting a completely different message from farmers out in the field now because um, just like every time prices go up, prices of the stuff we buy goes up as well. And it's kind of a good recipe to go down Poor Farm Road because we all know that once corn prices, bean prices kind of settle back down to normal, the prices that we're paying for inputs, particularly nitrogen fertilizer, are going to stay high. They always have. Um, like they say, grain prices take the stairs up and the elevator down, but input prices take the stairs up and then sit on a landing while grain prices take the elevator down. They just stay high and never seem to crash back down to normal. So, one of the big questions I've been getting here the past couple months is, hey, what can I plant after soybean harvest that's going to fix all the nitrogen I need to grow 200 bushel corn? And I'm going to plant it the 1st of November and I'm going to kill it the 1st of April. And about the only thing you can plant on your soybean stubble that will do that is a few spreaders of urea or trailers of anhydrous ammonia. There is no plant that can do that because if you want to figure out how much nitrogen you can expect from a legume based cover crop, essentially the amount of nitrogen is going to be directly proportional to the amount of biomass you have out there. And the amount of biomass that you can generate out there is going to be directly proportional to how many days of active growth you have. And of course, it's going to take, for a cool season cover crop, it's going to have to be over, about 45, 50 degrees to really kick into gear. Um, how many of those days, honestly, do you have between November 1st and April 1st? It's obviously not a lot. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a role for cover crops in a corn soybean rotation. Now, I'll talk about some possibilities and figure out some options and see just if there are things we can do that can dramatically reduce cost of our nitrogen fertilization and cut a few other inputs as well while we increase crop yields. So, how much nitrogen can we get from a legume crop? Well, first of all, legume nitrogen or legume biomass is going to average about 3% nitrogen. So, if you have a ton of legume biomass out in the field, 3% of that's going to be about 60 pounds per ton per acre. And the other thing you have to figure out, though, is just beyond that, how much nitrogen is in the biomass. The microbes that decay that biomass, all that legume nitrogen is in the form of protein. In order for protein to become plant available, it has to be broken down by microbes. And microbes are going to eat and incorporate into their bodies about half of that nitrogen. The rest of it will get excreted in plant available form. So about half of it becomes trapped in those microbes. Now, what happens to that that's trapped in the microbes? Essentially, about half of that microbial nitrogen will be broken down in each subsequent year. So if you have 240 total pounds now, you have about 120 pounds available to your first crop, about 60 available to next year, 30 available to the year after. And so you don't get it all the first year, about half. Now, the reason this becomes important to understand this is And I'll give you some examples as we go through. But if you continue this cover cropping program year after year after year, let's just say hypothetically, you have let's just say you're growing continuous corn with a winter legume cover crop every year between corn crops. And let's just say, hypothetically, high in the sky, that cover crop biomass is 4 tons per acre, and which would be about 240 total pounds of nitrogen. And you have 120 available to this first year. And then the next year, you'd have 60, and then 30, 15, so forth. Well, after you do the second cover crop, you've got 120 from this year's, but you've also got 60 from the year before. So now you actually have a pool of 180 pounds of available nitrogen, not just 120. And if you're in your third year of this program, you've got 120 plus 60 plus 30. Now you're looking at 210 pounds. And you can see the longer you do this program of cover cropping and using legumes in the system, the bigger the pool of organic nitrogen you can build up. So that becomes very, very important to realize over time the benefits of this process are cumulative. So let's just start. How do you fit cover crops into a corn bean rotation? So let's start out with corn, fresh harvested corn, and you're going to soybeans the next year. Okay, this is a place where rye works exceptionally well, and very, very hard to beat rye. Or triticale is very similar, planted after harvest. You can see this is rye that's been drilled after corn harvest into the residue, and then by the next spring, you got a really nice thick mat that you can use to plant soybeans into. And this rye is just really, rye is an ideal crop. If you're to pick only one species, rye is really an ideal crop to plant ahead of soybeans, and for several reasons. And this slide illustrates one of those reasons. What do you not see growing on the left of this photo where the cover crop was the prior year, or the prior spring, prior winter? So note the absence of weeds. Why are there no weeds where the cover crop was? Well, a grass cover crop can suppress weeds really by three mechanisms. One is just simply thickness of the mulch. Most weeds have very small seeds, contain very limited amount of energy. A pigweed seed contains enough energy, enough stored energy in that seed to grow a sprout about 3/4 of an inch. And if that seedling doesn't hit sunlight within 3/4 of an inch, it'll starve to death and die. It has to hit sunlight before it runs out of energy. If that mulch that it's growing through is more than an inch thick, pigweeds just cannot survive that. So if you can get a thick, uniform mulch without any gaps, your small seeded weeds just can't compete. Your soybeans, very large seed, contain a lot of energy and can poke up through that thick residue mat. Weed seedlings can't. Another thing that rye and several other cover crops have is essentially they contain natural herbicides. It's called allelopathy. Rye has 3 different compounds that are all in the benzoxazanone family, which is very similar chemically to dicamba. And those chemical compounds are toxic to a number of weed species, in particular pigweeds and mare's tail seem to be ultra sensitive to that. There are also some crops that are sensitive to that. Tomatoes are pretty sensitive to rye residue, at least in the seedling stage, not so much transplants. But the third mechanism by which cover crops can suppress weeds is simply through nitrogen exclusion or nitrogen sequestration. Because after a corn crop, if you have a well fertilized corn crop, it might contain, you might put 100 pounds of nitrogen on it, 150 or so go into the plant. There's usually about 25% of the nitrogen you apply to a corn crop is still out there in the field when you are harvesting. The next year, like over here to the right, that nitrogen can grow weeds. If, however, like on the left, you suck that nitrogen up and sequester it, not only does that suppress your weeds, it forces your soybeans to make more free nitrogen for you. They have to work for a living instead of sponging off the nitrogen that you purchased the year before. Now, that nitrogen in that cover crop doesn't go away. It's still out there in the field. It's just temporarily unavailable, and it'll kick back when that cover crop decays. And this can be really pretty effective. You can see here's some Oklahoma State University research. Look at this. 2 months after planting, 9 times more weeds. And this is just the weed count, not necessarily the weed biomass. The weed biomass is much, much higher without the rye cover crop. Is not only do they not germinate as well, they don't grow as well. They don't grow as fast, they don't grow as tall, they don't grow as big. And therefore they don't compete as much. Now, obviously, the earlier you get out there and you plant that rye, the more nitrogen it can sequester. Take a look at this top line here. This was planted October 1st. This one was planted October 15th. And this one was planted October 30th. And you can see you are sequestering the one planted early. Look at that, over 150 pounds per acre of nitrogen. If you're on particularly a sandy soil with some heavy winter precipitation, that 150 pounds of nitrogen may have otherwise just ended up in groundwater, which is bad if you're drinking the water, but it's also bad because that's fertilizer that you paid for that you're no longer able to utilize. So even though your grass cover crops don't make nitrogen, they can hold nitrogen and keep it there for future crops, keep it from being lost over the winter, and help with your weed control. Now, because it's desirable to get that cover crop started earlier in the fall, people are experimenting with all different kinds of ways of getting that cover crop started before the corn's actually harvested. And one way is with aerial seeding, of course. This was seeded with an airplane. This was under a pivot. It's got some turnips, some radishes, some ryegrass, and cereal rye. And so that is going to make some phenomenal. I took this the day of harvest. It's going to make some, and it was already fenced. And as soon as the combine left the field, in went the cattle. Now, you can aerial seed without an airplane. This is one of those Hagee interseeders used to seed cover crops. You go in there, roughly a black layer. You can see the bottom leaves are starting to dry up a little bit. So the canopy's starting to break up and allow some sunlight down into that canopy. Now, here's another possibility. This is corn in 60-inch rows. And the cover crop was actually seeded at about V3 to V5 stage on this, 3 to 5 leaf corn. The initial perception of this practice is that, oh gosh, then you're just planting weeds and they're going to compete against your corn. Research has been pretty conclusive that as long as you give corn about a 1-month head start over other plants, it'll outcompete it, and they really don't cause any yield loss. Now, the first people have tried this in 30-inch corn, and it sort of works in 30-inch corn, but it really, really explodes in 60-inch corn. I'll talk about that in a bit. The idea behind seeding at V4 versus like black layer of corn in September, this would be like in late May or early June. Why would you seed in late May or early? First time someone told me they were doing this, I thought that's stupid. Why would you be planting these cool season crops right before the heat of summer hits? And guy just asked me, he said, what are the limiting factors to establishment of a cover crop in standing corn? I said, well, lack of sunlight and lack of moisture. He said, do you get on average more rainfall in June or September? Well, obviously, it's June. Said, do you get more sunlight in June or September? Well, obviously, again, more hours of daylight in June than in September. So you just can't assume that because you haven't seen it done that it won't work. Now, what they did find in 30-inch rows, there's just really not enough sunlight in there for that cover crop to really thrive. It can sometimes survive, but it doesn't really take off until about black layer. And one of the advantages of this versus aerial seeding is that you're getting, because what they're doing essentially here is taking a drill over the corn when it's just 3-4 inch tall and drilling, so you're getting good seed to soil contact and not dependent on too quick rains like you are with aerial seeding or overhead irrigation. This is something that can work better in dry land situation. But where people have done this in 60-inch rows, like Lauren Steinlage is doing here, that's where this has really exploded. And here's another look at a field of 60-inch corn just prior to harvest. Now, say to a lot of people, this seems like you're going backwards. And if your only goal in this is to grow corn, you are going backwards. If that is your only goal, because what they tell me is, let's just say you're in a 200 bushel corn environment. 30-inch rows will make about 200 bushel. If you go to 60-inch rows and you do everything correctly, you're probably looking at about 190 bushel corn, about a 5% yield hit. So why would you do this if you're going to give up 10 bushel of corn? Right now, 10 bushel of corn is worth $50, $60 an acre. What's a ton of cattle feed worth, especially in the fall when you might otherwise be feeding hay? What's the value of taking corn stalks, which are usually just maintenance feed, and like this Bayou kale here, turning it into green, high protein, highly nutritious feed? What's a ton of that feed worth? So if you take this, what they tell me is that when they do the V4 interseeding in 30-inch corn, they get about a ton per acre of biomass come fall harvest. Whereas when they do the 60-inch, they may get 4 or 5 tons per acre of biomass. So you give up $50 an acre worth of corn, but if you figure that biomass might be worth $100 a ton in hay replacement or in beef per acre, if you can gain a couple 100 pounds of beef per acre, that's worth a lot more than $50 worth of corn. So it depending on your situation might make a lot of sense. Now, if you want to make give 60-inch corn, yes,
We have a question before you go on.
Just
sure.
When he's talking about the biomass that's produced, is he talking in terms of dry matter or just actual?
Yes, dry matter.
That is dry matter? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean the dry matter can be pretty impressive on that interseeded cover crop. At least that's the stories I hear. So sometimes you wonder how big the fish really was, but the stories I hear are pretty impressive. So if you're trying to make the corn itself you're trying to keep the corn yield as close as possible to what you get in 30-inch rows. So you keep the per acre population the same, you double up in the row. And so you got just as many corn plants per acre out there. Then it becomes imperative, because within the row, it's like you're planting, 60, 70,000 plants per acre. You got to slow that planter down. Otherwise, it's just, those sprockets are just going too fast. Your chains are skipping, and, you're spraying seed out there too fast to get good seed placement and spacing. So slow the planter down if you're doing this. Also, it's very important to put your nitrogen adjacent to the corn row. Don't broadcast your nitrogen if you're doing this. And when I ask people, are you doing this, this, and this? People who like this practice are doing these three things. People who don't like this practice are skipping one or more of them. Okay, so that's some ideas after corn, prior to beans. What about if you're going after soybeans, prior to corn and sorghum? This is the one I'm getting all kinds of questions about. What can I plant after soybeans in October or November that's going to make all the nitrogen my corn crop needs, and I'm going to plant April 1st or something like that? Guys, there is no such plant. At least not in Nebraska, there's not. There might be other places, but not in Nebraska. Now, there are some plants that we can put in that. This is crimson clover. And crimson clover at, 20 years ago, it said, don't try to grow crimson clover north of, Wichita, Kansas. Well, as the varieties improved, that became I-70. And as varieties improved, that became like I-80. And so the crimson clover line, where crimson clover works, has been creeping north every year. Now, some of that might be due to global warming. We seem to be having warmer winters, and some of it might be due to better varieties. But whatever it is, I used to think crimson clover would never work in northern Kansas on a consistent basis. It has been. So now we're seeing it work in at least the southern half of Nebraska pretty well. It's creeping a little bit farther north every year. Another candidate is hairy vetch. Hairy vetch, very, very successful in northeast Nebraska. In fact, Madrid is Madison is from Madison, Nebraska. One of them at one time was the most commonly seeded hairy vetch variety in the United States. Very, very consistent performer. This is from our plot at Bladen. This is a mixture of vetch and rye. You can see 30 inches deep there. That is a very thick canopy. When we did our biomass sampling on this plot, we came up with 227 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that was about the 1st of June. And then this was roller crimped down, and we planted popcorn on top of it. And so if you take that rule of thumb that half that nitrogen is available, that's about 113, 114 pounds of available nitrogen. And we grew roughly, I think, 110 bushel popcorn on that, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, getting pretty close to that pound of nitrogen per expected bushel of yield. Now this is roller crimping the vetch to kill it instead of using herbicide, using a roller crimper and planting in one operation. And take a look at this. Not a weed out there. You like to know what kind of herbicide this guy used? He didn't use herbicide at all. This is organic. No herbicide, no tillage, no fertilizer, and no weeds. And I think this field made about 195 bushel. Now, I talked about rye controlling weeds because it sucked up the nitrogen. Well, vetch makes nitrogen, so how come there's not more weeds out here? Well, the key is the form that the nitrogen's in. The nitrogen here is in the form of protein, not nitrate. Weeds tend to be obligate nitrate feeders. They don't like nitrogen in organic forms. And so by having this out here, now corn can't use nitrogen in the form of protein very well either. But you as the farmer can row apply a small amount of nitrogen. Now this, you can put a little of, fish emulsion or some sort of, you only need a gallon or so an acre to get that corn off to a good enough start so that by the time, now look at this next slide, a month later, see how that's starting to change color, starting to decay. There's a lot of stems out here, but the leaves have essentially broken down, and that's starting to kick nitrogen back out to that corn. Look how green and good that looks. Now, I've got this is our a photo from our cover crop plot at Bladen. Take a look at this over here. This was planted October 1st. This is Balanza clover. To the right, to the left here is Wyoming winter peas. Obviously, quite a biomass difference. And in this late planting, I want to show you something that's critically important for making winter legumes work. Clover, your winter clovers are far more successful if they're planted early. Whereas peas and vetch can be quite successful even if planted late, as long as they're planted deep. And that deep planting is really important. And here's why. So over here to the left, I've got a pea seedling. And to the right, I have a soybean seedling. Now take a look at the difference in emergence. So the cotyledons on the pea stay below ground at emergence. The cotyledons on the soybean, and clover has the same type of emergence, but clover seedlings are really small, a lot easier to show on a soybean seedling. The cotyledons come above ground. So the first growing point on the soybean is going to be above the soil surface. No matter how deep you plant, that will come above ground. All your growing points will be above ground, exposed to winter cold. Same way with clovers. So you need to get enough development on those winter clovers before you get good hard freezes to develop that secondary root system. So planting clovers late is really predisposing them to winter kill. On peas and vetch, however, as long as you plant deep, these growing points, there's going to be a growing point right here on this, right where the seed is. And then every half inch above it, there's going to be another growing point. So the deeper you plant, the more growing points you're going to have below ground. So peas and vetch can be planted after soybean harvest and still be successful. Most winter clovers cannot. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use winter clovers out there, but if you're going to use winter clovers, they probably should be aerial seeded at leaf yellowing. You kind of want them in really the first half of September if you're going to make crimson clover, Balanza clover work very well. Peas and vetch can be drilled after soybean harvest with reasonable expectation of success. Now, okay, that's pretty much all your options in a corn soybean rotation. Not much, is it? So I'm going to ask you here, if that's your only options, why are you in a corn soybean rotation? Why are you in a corn soybean rotation? If you are, I'm going to give you a really good piece of advice. Get out now. Get out. See, you can make a corn soybean rotation work just fine as long as you're willing to keep doing this, throwing a lot of money at it. If you're willing to write really big checks, you can make a corn soybean rotation work economically, but barely. It basically takes a lot of acres because the margin is going to be so slim. And even when we get good prices like we got now, the input prices are going to rise to match that and keep you in this, basically keep you on the hamster wheel. There are a lot of agronomic problems that come with that corn soybean rotation, and some of them you can address with money, like nitrogen fertilizer. Others, like this Goss's wilt, aren't so easy to address, or this white mold of soybeans, or soybean cyst nematode, or sudden death syndrome. When you extend that rotation out and include more crops, the more diverse you make that rotation, the higher the yield you can get on each crop within the rotation. So you can see all this, 105 up to 135 as you include a more complex rotation, and especially as you put this forage legume cover crop in prior to the corn. Now, as far as economics go, all these plots received 160 pounds of nitrogen. Obviously, the continuous corn requires that. What about this corn following red clover? Probably not. I mean, depending on how that red clover was managed, if it were hayed, probably would not meet all the nitrogen needs of the corn, but if it were pastured, probably would. Okay, so what happens if you extend that rotation out? Let's say you put wheat in there. What can you do following wheat harvest? Well, here's an option. You can put sun hemp out there. This field of sun hemp was planted double crop after wheat harvest, and this photo was taken September 20th. So less than 90 days after it was. Look at all that biomass. That's 9 foot tall. And this is on a field that was so poor it had never raised corn crop to maturity ever. It was just nothing but blow sand. Now, if you want to make this even better, throw in some cowpeas, a vining summer legume, so you can get those cowpea vines like here climbing those sun hemp plants. So here's cowpea and here is sun hemp stalk, and one is climbing the other, and you get basically this big jungle effect out there that suppresses weeds and captures every little blade, every little photon is hitting a green leaf and creating energy, drive the nitrogen fixation process. And this is a photo of one of our customers in northwest Missouri. And he planted a mixture of sun hemp and cowpeas and a little bit of, I don't know if this is sorghum sudan, I believe. And he's going in there in late August. This was planted double crop after wheat, going in late August, roller crimping that down, and then drilling cool season cover crops out there. He's basically creating a relay race going from summer annual legumes, and there might be 100 to 150 pounds of available nitrogen in this biomass as you're looking at it here. When you add the cool season cover crop in there to follow up, like here's one of our plots, this tan colored legume here that's winter killed, that's spring field peas that was fall planted, and next to it is fava beans, the dark stuff. It's fava beans. Is there any advantage to this dark colored residue come early spring? Sure, that's going to catch sunlight and warm soil up. Here's a look at fava beans. Now you can also, because you are planting, this is end of August. So compared to planting a cover crop after, in October after corn or soybean harvest, you can get a lot of species that'll work. And we have a saying in the cover crop business, everything works in August. If you plant in August, warm season, cool season plants, they all work. Everything in our inventory really works well planted in August, assuming you get some moisture, of course, decent growing conditions. But as far as time of year, you can get everything to grow in August. And so you can throw in things like radishes and get those great big radishes that you see in the pictures this time of year. And you can create that relay race that can extend your period of nitrogen fixation essentially from July clear on up through following April or May, depending on how long you leave that. Now, here's another option for you. People say, well, I don't want to grow wheat. I don't have the equipment to raise wheat. My local elevator doesn't take wheat. I can't market wheat, or, we're too, whatever excuse you have for not growing a small grain. This is a way of including those winter cereals in your rotation without having to market a different grain crop. That's the corn, beans, cattle rotation. So essentially what this does is following soybean harvest, you put in your winter cereal and maybe a winter legume as well. So let's say you put in triticale and winter peas, or rye and hairy veg. You put in a mixture and you graze that. Instead of harvesting it for grain, you would graze that, say, next April, and then follow that up with a planting of summer annuals, kind of like what I showed you there earlier. Sun hemp, cowpeas, mung beans, sunflowers, sorghum sudan, buckwheat, a big complex mix. If you really want to change the nature of your soil fast, there is no better way than a diverse summer cover crop that's about 50% or more of the biomass being sorghum sudan. Sorghum sudan is truly a miracle soil builder. It just pumps a tremendous amount of sugar below ground. And when you pump, the real key to making cover crops work, and previous speaker alluded to this, is to pump a lot of sugar below ground. The more root exudates you can create, the faster your soil is going to improve. And no other plant does that quite like sorghum sudan in a narrow growing window. Now, I'll show you some things that are better yet, but they're long-term things, not short-term like sorghum sudan. I'll show you something. This is went on a trip to Africa, and this is basically a Haney test that they showed me from October 11th in 2018. So this essentially is their spring planting season in South Africa. And look at this: 14 pounds of available nitrogen, 10 pounds of available phos. They planted a diverse cover crop, basically like this. This would look almost identical to what they were grazing over there. And here is the soil. They applied no fertilizer whatsoever. And this is what their soil test 1 year and 1 week after. And look at this: 147 pounds of nitrogen, 101 pounds of phosphorus. Now, say, well, yeah, the legumes fix some nitrogen here. Look at this: the phosphorus availability buildup. How'd that happen? Well, when you apply phosphorus fertilizer, those of you that took a college soils class were probably told that only about 15% of the phosphorus you apply actually gets into your crop. Well, what happens to the other 85%? Well, it's bound in your soil to clay. It's bound by calcium. It's bound by aluminum. It's bound by iron. It's bound by manganese. And well, does it stay bound forever? Well, that depends on how you manage your soil. That phosphorus can be freed up from those bound forms through biological action. How do you get biological action? Same way you get stray cats. You feed it. When you feed that biology, you get more biology. And that biology can free up those unavailable forms of phosphorus that you've been building up over the years. Now, here's another concept. If you really, if you want to make a change in your soil over 3 months, sorghum sudan. If you want to make, or I should say in one growing season, that's cattle, basically corn, then beans, have a winter cover crop that you graze out, summer cover crop that you graze out, and another winter cover crop you graze out before you rotate back to corn. Where within 1 year off of that corn bean rotation, you squeeze in 3 grazed cover crops. That's going to give you about the fastest 1 year impact, other than importing a bunch of manure or something, about the best 1 year positive soil impact you can create. If you are looking at a decade and you want to create positive soil impact, take a look at this perennial ley farming. Now, ley farming is a term that was developed by a number of British authors back around 1890. Um, Sir George Stapleton had a book called The Clifton Park System of Farming. Robert Elliott. There's some Newman Turner was another proponent of this, and basically this ley farming consisted of planting a mixture like this, a productive pasture mixture, taking cropland, putting it back to pasture, including deep-rooted forbs and legumes and grasses, and pasturing using rotational grazing, and doing that for about 5 years. And once you do that for about 5 years, some neat things happen. Number one, you build up a huge pool of organic nitrogen. You never need to buy nitrogen fertilizer again. You can do corn, beans, wheat, and then back to your pasture. Never have to buy fertilizer again. And the other thing that happens is your soil structure becomes phenomenal. So your soil becomes very absorptive of rainfall, your erosion goes away, and you get a really desirable soil structure. And the reason you get that desirable soil structure is your perennial plants just have these massive root systems. This is a intermediate wheatgrass, and this is winter wheat. Take a look at that. And winter wheat only has this kind of root system for a couple months out of the year. This wheatgrass, these are closely related species, one a perennial, the other an annual. This has this kind of root system 12 months out of the year. Talk about root exudates. There's no comparison here. And the guys like Newman Turner and Robert Elliott and those other proponents of ley farming were very, very insistent that a high percentage of this perennial pasture mix be deep tap-rooted forbs like this chicory. And the reason they wanted the deep tap-rooted forbs, you can see this. This is University of Nebraska. Dr. Weaver from back in the 1920s dug into prairie grass meadows and pastures and examined the root structure. He's really the first guy that has studied these native prairie plant root structures. Look how deep these tap-rooted forbs go. And when you plant that, you don't just plant straight brome or straight fescue. Take a look at this. This is Manhattan, Kansas, unfertilized cool season grass, fescue. Brome would be almost identical. You fertilize it. Of course, this is additional money, but you double the yield. You add in red clover. You do the same thing as 80 pounds of nitrogen. You add protein to the mix. At the same time, you add production, and it's a lot cheaper than fertilizer. And that clover lasts for 2-3 years. Or you can add in alfalfa. Take a look at this. That's 5 times the yield that you're getting without the fertilizer. And if you graze this, all this cycles back out onto the field. Now, this is clipped, not grazed. So the nitrogen these legumes produce is being removed from the field. Whereas in a grazing situation, that manure and that urine would be cycling back to the field itself. If you are looking for soil improvement, do not hay this. Graze it so that you get the manure and urine return. And don't just use whatever cheap genetics you can get. This is medium red clover. I mean, we sell this, everybody sells it. take a look at this, about a foot tall. This is about 100 feet away from that previous photo. And this is our big red clover, new variety. Look at that. Same sunlight, same rainfall, same soil, 32 inches. You tell me which one's going to create more impact for your soil. When you add in that perennial crop, you are looking at a big increase in organic matter. This is land planted to grass, is the black line here. This green line is grass within a crop rotation. So the only rotations that really dramatically increased soil organic matter were the ones that included a perennial forage crop. Now, how does that impact yield? Well, this is a study that was done at the University of Florida, compared continuous peanut with no chemical inputs, pretty miserable yield. You had fungicides, double the yield. Had fungicide and nematicide, triple the yield. But you're looking at pretty devastating effect on soil biology by applying all that. Also devastating on the pocketbook. All those inputs are expensive. And then you go to a better rotation that includes this and requires no nematicide, no fungicide, none of those inputs. I mean, you're talking 5 times the yield with fewer inputs. And here's the big upside. I thought this, in this rotation, it only required 250 acres to raise a family versus these rotations, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,800 acres. How many more farm families can you fit in a county if you have people farming in this sod-based rotation? I think the get big or get out message that we received back in the 1970s was some of the dumbest advice ever sputtered on a public stage. The get big or get out message basically resulted in a lot of farmers getting out. And when you lose, we as a country have lost our rural nature because we got rid of too many farmers back in the 70s and 80s. Okay, here's a final option for fitting legumes into that corn soybean rotation. What about having a perennial cover? Now, this is probably best suited, honestly, even though I'm not a fan of continuous corn, this is a way of maybe making continuous corn work for you. This is a perennial cover crop. This is a white clover. University of Minnesota and University of Georgia have tried Kura clover, which seems to be a bit more successful. But in this one, they sprayed a little strip and planted corn into it. On other ones, I've seen where they tilled a strip and planted into it. And so here's the reason for this. Number one, you got a legume that makes nitrogen. The other thing this does is it suppresses weeds. It's hard for a weed to get through that tight canopy because it's more than an inch thick, and it's tight and sunlight can't get down there. And then once this corn reaches what we used to call cultivation stage, you go down those rows with this device called a row mow, simply a hydraulic motor on this little mower deck that chops that clover and turns it into mulch, chops both weeds and clover, turns it into a mulch, and blows it out at the base of the corn plants where it decays, becomes nitrogen, and becomes weed control. It's a weed suppressing mulch. And the mowing essentially converts that green vegetation into decaying vegetation so the nitrogen gets released. And this has been a very, very interesting system. A number of Iowa State, University of Minnesota, University of Georgia are all doing research on this concept, and know a few farmers that are doing it now too. And just think how good of a stock pasture would you have following harvest once that clover regrows and fills back in. That's a lot of feed. A lot of feed off of an acre there. Okay, I have wrapped up here. What are your questions?
Dale, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can we at some point just get a little too hung up on just legumes before corn? Should we always be thinking
Absolutely. A solid stand of legumes, and thank you for bringing that up, because we do get fixated on legumes because we get fixated on nitrogen. A legume monoculture is not necessarily desirable. There may be situations where that's the way to go, but in almost all situations, like I said, we want legumes for nitrogen, but your soil development really occurs from high sugar exudates. And to get those high sugar exudates, you really want grasses. And you should have mixtures that contain a fair amount of grasses are going to give you much better results than monoculture legumes. You'll have more biomass, you'll have better soil structure, and I think a grass legume combination can fix just as much nitrogen as solid legumes, as long as those legumes are, competing well. It's hard for summer legumes to compete with sorghum sudan, but most winter legumes can compete fairly well with your winter cereals. I mean, grasses are going to make more biomass than legumes. That's just the nature of the beast, almost always. But and that's one of the reasons why grasses are so desirable, because what you see above ground is often reflective of what is happening below ground as well. Bigger, more vigorous plants tend to have bigger, more vigorous roots in general. Not always, but in general. So getting legumes, forbs, getting diversity out. Diversity is critical for soil development. Grasses, legumes, and forbs of several different plant families. And that's becoming very, very obvious from some recent research that by getting 4 or more plant families, grasses are one plant family, legumes are another, brassicas are one, the sunflower family is another, cucurbits are one, you got quinopods are another. By getting more plant families out there, you get a greater diversity of root exudates. And when you get that diversity of root exudates, your microbial population really starts to explode. And that's when you start to see real soil benefits. So thank you. Very, very timely, very useful comment.
Neil, I have another question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So in our last presentation, we saw a study where since 1982 they had been continuous corn with no nitrogen, and then they had a soybean corn like before. Anyway, their highest yielding one was corn, soybeans, grain sorghum, and oats, and then back to corn.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea why that might be, or?
And this was with no added nitrogen.
Interesting. Sorghum will a lot of times, like if you plant corn right after sorghum, there a lot of times there's a yield depression, because sorghum pumps an insane. I saw one study where they measured the amount of sugar produced below ground, and grain sorghum, not sorghum sudan, but grain sorghum, had 16 times the amount of root exudate that corn had. Now, when you pump that much sugar below ground, that creates a big, a very high carbon nitrogen ratio that a lot of times will cause a depression in nitrogen availability, and which can reduce the yield of a following corn crop or wheat crop. But by creating that that you're also creating a very abundant microbial population. And I think one of the forms of microbes that we have most neglected in looking at in research, everybody knows that the microbes that live on legume roots and those nodules fix nitrogen. But some of the very first discovered soil microbes ever were free living nitrogen fixers, things like Bayerinkia, Azotobacter, Azospirillum. And those organisms will thrive. One of the absolute best hosts for those organisms is your sorghum family because of the amount of root exudates they produce. Very good at building up those populations of free living nitrogen fixers. And nitrogen has to be coming from somewhere. And I think free living nitrogen fixers is as good an explanation as any for that rotation producing those yields. That's speculation on my part, but that seems to be a growing consensus, is that some of these and the way these free living nitrogen fixers work is really unusual because they have a very unusual niche in the soil because they live off root exudates as an energy source. And roots grow in aerobic soil. Has to have oxygen for roots to work. But these microbes only fix nitrogen in anaerobic soil. So they have to live in close proximity to a root, but in anaerobic soil. Where do you find such a thing? There's just, you've got seemingly contrary conditions for these microbes to live in. Well, it turns out soil microbiologists have examined these soils, and if you can get a soil aggregate, of course, the more organic matter you have, the more root exudates you have, the bigger your aggregates become. As a soil aggregate gets bigger than about 3/8 of an inch, about 10 millimeters in diameter, the oxygen diffusion rate into the center is not fast enough to keep up with the microbial use of that oxygen. And what the result is you get this anaerobic core where your azotobacter, your azospirillums, those types of free living nitrogen fixers can reside. And once you get them the right kind of environment, we don't know how much nitrogen they can produce. We just know that in our typical low organic matter cropland situation, they don't do much. 8 to 10 pounds of nitrogen a year. What happens when you do create the right conditions for them? Such as a very high organic matter soil, and very few people, have created those kinds of conditions. And those that have, they're like, I crank out these very high yields, and I don't need to use nitrogen fertilizer, and I don't understand why. Where's the nitrogen coming from? I think that's where your nitrogen is coming from when you get to these long-term no-till cover crop fields that are kicking out these unusually high yields without nitrogen fertilizer. And Richard Mulvaney, University of Illinois, is doing some research right now on that very topic. So I think that's going to be very, very exciting. It might be possible that we can have soils that produce their own nitrogen fertilizer in the future as we begin to understand this process. Other questions?
How thick was that vetch planted where you were roller crimping?
That particular field was planted at 40 pounds an acre, and that was an organic field. So nitrogen, weed control and nitrogen production are both, priorities. That's about twice as thick as what I'd ever recommend planting vetch. But that was also aerial seeded and soybean leaf yellowing. So he wanted a thick stand, and expense was not because, you're getting organic premiums and it's so critical to get the weeds choked out. It's so critical to get as much nitrogen as you can.
So we're being bombarded with biological ads. Is that a method to increase the speed of this stuff working?
I think it can be helpful. You will never inoculate your way to soil health. I think that's important to understand. Just like, you'll never make yourself healthy with a vaccine. You need to have, the vaccine only works because it primes your immune system. The vaccine itself is useless. Your immune system gives you protection. Vaccine just triggers the immune system to work. So an inoculation can introduce organisms that are not currently present in your soil. I think I'm a big fan of inoculating with mycorrhizal fungi if they're lacking in your soil. And most farm fields I've looked at are extremely lacking in mycorrhizal fungi. So I'm a big fan of inoculating with that organism as a beginner. But even mycorrhizal fungi, if you put it on a corn crop and then let that field go fallow over the winter in a corn soybean rotation, your mycorrhizal fungi are going to die out in the winter. There's no root exudates to keep them alive. They have to have a live root. So inoculation can be a good addition to a soil building program. They're not a replacement. You have to have the live root exudates. That's so critical. You have to have the cover, the soil armor. You have to have all your other components in place. And when you do, I think they're especially useful if you're in the transition period from, let's say, conventional tillage or even no-till, but without cover crops. If you are introducing cover crops for the first time to your system, that's when you'll probably get the biggest bang for your buck out of an inoculation. And some products are very good. Some are worthless. I remember I went to a meeting one time. I spoke at this meeting, and there were two companies there that both had a product that had an almost identical looking label. The species within them were the exact same species. And neither of them badmouthed the other's product at all. And I looked, and one of them had a concentration of 1 times 10 to the 4th colony forming units of each microbe. That's 10,000 in a gram. The other one had 10 to the 9th colony forming units. That's 5 more zeros. So that's like, instead of 10,000, that's 5 more zeros on 10,000. 100 million. I mean, obviously, one of those products, one costs $20 a gallon, the other one costs $9. And if you don't understand, logarithms and exponents, then the $9 a gallon stuff looks a lot better. Same ingredients. But once you realize concentration and the relative value that one was, 5 zeros, that's 100,000 times more microbes in per gallon in the one jug that costs $20. And all legitimate organisms, but one was just 99.99999% repeating water. And turned out that the one company was buying their product from the other guy and cutting it with water, 1 gallon into 100,000 gallons and reselling the product. So, buyer beware on some of these products. Don't believe testimonials. I mean, do your own strip trials, replicated. I've got a book out, and it talks about, one of the chapters in the book is how do you evaluate biological products? And because Some of them are good, some of them are crap. But none of them replace a good soil health program. They're an addition to a good soil health program. Other questions?
You were saying that rye is a nitrogen holding type crop and soybeans work better after rye. How long does it take to release that nitrogen?
A lot of it depends on the maturity, the stage of maturity when you kill the rye. The more mature it gets, the slower it's going to decay. Typically, and in order for decay is microbial in nature, and microbes need warm temperatures, they need moisture, and they need protected from ultraviolet light to really do their job. So a lot of times you see soybeans and rye residue, and that it'll be bright yellow, almost brass colored. And then once the soybeans canopy, then within just a week or so, it starts turning dark and starts rotting away. So if you can get a good canopy, especially under pivot irrigation where you've got surface moisture, or you're creating, dews in the morning, so you got that film of moisture, then stuff will start rotting pretty quick. So it's basically dependent on how many stage of maturity when the rye is killed. The younger maturity is going to rot faster than more advanced maturity, and then your how many days of warm, wet, dark conditions do you have from that point? So, and it's got a decay sequence, a half-life, just like your legume residue. It doesn't, it's like August 1st, there's no available nitrogen. August 2nd, there's all the 150 pounds that are in there gets given up. Doesn't work like that. It's a slow trickle out, but just much slower decay process than the legumes.
How important is it to, before planting, after planting, to kill that cover crop for the cash crop to get the most benefit? Is it 15 days? Is it before planting? Is it day of planting? Is it a week after planting? Is there
it depends. It depends entirely on what crop we're talking about. If let's say rye prior to corn. Now in corn belt, a lot of people will plant, the only cover crop they use is rye. They use rye after corn before beans. They'll use rye after beans before corn. And rye before corn can cause some issues. One is nitrogen sequestration, which can be pretty important. I mean, I showed you there where, rye planted October 1st in that trial sequestered 150 pounds of nitrogen. That's a lot of nitrogen to have to compensate for in the next corn crop. Another factor on rye prior to corn is that rye harbors fusarium root rot, which can, if you plant corn into green growing rye, that fusarium root rot can transfer right over to your corn plants. That can be pretty devastating. I mean, that can be a 30 bushel an acre hit pretty easy right there. So to prevent both of those problems, if you are planting corn into a rye cover crop, I would kill that rye cover crop 2 weeks ahead. Now, that rule, like most rules, it depends. If the longer you cover crop, the healthier your soil is going to become. The bigger the pool of mineralizable nitrogen you're going to create, and the more fusarium eating organisms you're going to create in the soil. People who the very first time they plant a cover crop and they plant corn into rye, A lot of times they'll just have a disaster. They say, I'm never doing this again. But people who have been cover cropping for 5-10 years, they can have just normal corn yields and the exact same stand of rye that their neighbor has where they had a disaster because their soil health is built up to where the fusarium is no longer an issue. It's just part of the food chain. They've got a bunch of organisms out there that honestly eat fusarium. University of Nebraska did a trial like back in the 80s where they did continuous corn with a rye cover crop between each corn crop. And they put 160 pounds of nitrogen out there every year. And, well, actually, it's 240. 160 on that other study I showed you. So they're putting quite a bit of nitrogen out there. The first 3 years they did that, the corn following rye did 10 bushel an acre worse than corn without the rye cover crop. Now, if you're a farmer and you see this 10 bushel yield hit for 3 years running, you're saying, I'm not doing that again. That's a money losing deal. Spend money on seed and then get worse yield. The next 2 years of the study, almost exactly the same. But what's curious is the last 5 years of the study, they had a 30 bushel increase in the rye plots. Increase. Why is that? Well, it's because your soil's getting healthier and you're sequestering that nitrogen, you're building it, and they measured the pool and they had a much larger pool of nitrogen. Now, that was not the case in the early years. They had less nitrogen available. It was all sequestered. But where they did it over time, they're building up this big pool of nitrogen. They're also building up desirable soil structure. They're building up soil health and, having healthier root systems. So don't confuse short-term effects with long-term effects. The more you understand how this works, the more you realize that this is a marathon, not a sprint. Treat it like you would your New Year's resolution to work out more. Why do you want to work out more? Well, I want to feel better. You feel better about day 3 of your workout program. No, you feel awful. But you have to go through that in order to get the long-term benefits. So treat cover cropping the same way as you do a workout program. The rewards are in the long term, not the immediate. And if you understand things like carbon nitrogen ratio and nitrogen cycling and all these sort of things, if you have a train wreck, try to understand why you had that. Cover crops don't increase nor decrease yield by themselves. They somehow affect a growth factor or a pest or a disease that's reducing yield. Knowing that, you can adjust your management to minimize any issues and to maximize benefits.
All right, they're all thinking about what you said, Dale. Well, we appreciate you joining us tonight. And,
Absolutely.